So we are on time period 3, which is 1750 to 1900. We're on part 2 of this review, which is unit 6. So we're starting on 6.1, which is page 116 for those of you following along. This is mostly about imperialism and migration patterns. It's pretty easy stuff. This will not take very long. So for example, Lindsay, you will not have to worry about leaving early. We'll be done by the time you have your volleyball meeting, okay? All right, so rationales for imperialism. What is a rationale? What does that word mean?
It's like a justification or reasoning for it.
Correct. So why do we become imperialists? Well, anyone, what are some reasons? This is not difficult stuff.
Money and power.
Okay. Sierra, what were you going to say?
Resources.
Okay, economic resources specifically. So can anyone give me an example of a specific resource that we are looking for at this time? A little different than some of our previous time periods.
Would it be coal?
Not so much. By the time we're doing imperialism, coal power is not as essential as it was earlier. Plus, we found other resources for it, and pretty much everybody outside of Japan has. I mean, the United States and Western Europeans have lots of coal, so they don't really need to get any domestic or foreign. They have it domestically. But good guess though. Anyone else?
Gold.
Kind of, not really. A little bit, South Africa, but that's not the main motivation. The answer is rubber. Rubber, tires, bicycles, cars, eventually airplanes and other wheeled vehicles in the 20th century. We cannot make rubber synthetically until the middle of the 20th century. So if we have any car, any bicycle that has tires, got to come from the sap of a rubber tree, which grows tropically in the Amazon and in Central Africa. So we're going to establish many colonies in Central Africa for that. There are other resources as well, but those are amongst the biggest. So economic, definitely one. Also new markets, which is part of economic. We want more people to sell our goods to. So resources from potential customers as well. Can I get any other justification that is provided for imperialism by Europeans at this time?
I remember
Religion?
Felt like
Okay.
Like social Darwinism. They
Okay,
use like scientific racism basically.
good. So we had 2 answers there. Sebastian said religion. We'll start with that. Then we'll go to what Aiden said. Both are correct. So religion, we're trying to spread our faith. We know that today, majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa are primarily Christian. That comes from 19th century European intervention. Also, it is the missionaries that spread language and education. The governments were not interested in doing so. We wanted to keep people without that knowledge because then they need us. However, the missionaries want to spread their language because it allows people to read the Bible, which is something they want. And it's much easier for me to teach some people German or French or Portuguese than it is for me to learn dozens of local languages and try to translate the Bible, which is a fairly large book, into all those local languages. So therefore, it is to spread our faith, absolutely. The other one Aiden mentioned is social Darwinism, this notion, as you all know the basics of Darwin and your study of biology. Darwin does not address human race at all, ever. It's not something he talks about, but people read his works about how one species dominates another, and they extrapolate or take and add this notion that it also applies to human race. And since this is a time when white Europeans are beginning to dominate much of their fellow humans on the planet, the justification is made for, as Aiden said, scientific racism, that there are theories about why this is true, the size of one's head, or all sorts of ridiculous foolishness that are entirely debunked later, but at the time believed. And so the most common phrase we associate with social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, which is something Darwin never said, even though if I said, tell me something about evolution, you'd probably say that first or second if you were talking about anything about evolution. But that's not something that Darwin ever himself wrote. And so this is our justification for this behavior. Also, remember we talked about a poem called The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. He of the Jungle Book. Mr. Kipling insinuated that the white man's burden was in fact being much better than all other races, and therefore we must civilize the planet. And so that is part of our justification as well. The other reason I would give before we move on is just good old-fashioned nationalist competition. If I have more colonies than you, I'm better than you. So that's definitely part of it. Special guest star in Sierra's feed there. All right. So everybody good with that? That's pretty easy. Questions? Anyone? Anyone? Some of you have been on almost every single one of these and you have yet to unmute. That's okay, but I'm keeping tabs. I mean, for really no reason. I just find it interesting. So 6.2, state expansion. So as states get bigger, empires get larger. This is one of those, the College Board covers all sorts of potential topics. Like some states get bigger with colonies they already had. Okay. The best example of that, or they take over from non-state entities. This would be an example of India. India had been conquered by a private corporation, the British East India Company. The British government will take it over towards the end of time period 3 because of rebellion in India, where British citizens who are living in the colony are attacked. So the British government comes in, whooping and stomping on people because they're mad that their citizens have been attacked. And they will be much harsher in their rule over the British towards the end of their time in India than they were at the beginning. We also know the United States engages in this behavior. As a kid, it was one of those things I never really thought about American imperialism, but the Hawaiians didn't ask us to show up and take over. We just did. That's by definition imperialism. That's what that is. I think I told you this story when I went to Hawaii, gosh, about 13, 12 years ago, whatever it was now. We met with a group that was the Hawaiian independence movement, who they were like the American imperialists. And I was like, huh? Because I was in paradise. We were on the beach and we were having a good time and hanging out. I did not even think about the fact that America had imperialized Hawaii. We did. We did not do so to nearly the extent of other European powers, but we certainly did conquer people without their permission, which by definition is imperialism. And that is still part of our nation today. The Puerto Ricans didn't ask us to take them over. We did. So, and we didn't have the common courtesy to give them statehood. So there's all that kind of stuff is definitely part of American history as well. The Japanese are also engaging in this. The Japanese are going to spread out into China, eventually in period 4 into Korea, into Pacific Islands, and we know that this will help lead to World War II, their aggressive expansionism. Now, the third part on that page 117, 6.2, talks about using both warfare and diplomacy to expand influence into Africa. What is diplomacy? If you are diplomatic, what does that mean?
Would that be like giving people more rights than they already have?
No, generally no. That's not a good guess, but no. Thank you for the effort, though.
Don't they like look out for their country's rights over like in other countries and stuff?
Getting warmer. So let's say this. Let's say as a teacher on parent-teacher conference night, and this is never or parent open house. I can't even remember school words anymore. I've lost it all. And let's say that a parent comes in and is mad because we just had our first test and their son or daughter, did poorly. And they come in just ripping me a new one. How dare you? My daughter's never failed a test and she did awful and she's upset, blah, 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 in front of like 20 people on open house. And I just sit there and let them yell at me and go, thanks. How about we have a conversation about this at another time? This is not the best avenue for this. And I appreciate that you're upset that your daughter did not perform well, but perhaps we should discuss your daughter's study habits or her level of preparation. And we have a long way to go. But if that's my response, I handled it diplomatically. I did not yell back. I did not scream. I did not try to defend myself. I just kind of said, okay, let's calm down here. Let's relax. Now, the likelihood Mr. Rich would respond this way, probably not high. But let's just assume that it did. That would be diplomatic. So that means instead of like going, you just go, hey. I don't know if you've ever had that situation where somebody's really angry and frustrated and your response is totally calm and chill. That tends to de-escalate. It tends to bring it down because sometimes you want to get in a fight. You want to like yell at somebody and have them yell back. So that is to be a diplomatic. Diplomacy is the art of negotiation. So instead of going to war, we go into African territories, we being Europeans, the British, the French, whomever, and say, look, y'all know we can conquer you. We conquered your neighbor last month. You know you're next. Do we want to do this? How about you sign this piece of paper and you just let us have it? Results are the same except for, hey, nobody has to die. We're not going to shoot anybody. How about that? This actually starts to happen because word gets around. The Europeans have technology that is far superior. And the Europeans don't want to fight because it's going to cost, bullets are expensive and they might have some soldiers who lose their lives as well. And they would prefer to have a population that is not angry at them when they take over as much. In fact, I used to give a DBQ that I loved, but it's 7 documents. So I'm not going to have you do it now. That was about African reactions to European imperialism, this very topic. And the first document in that DBQ, which again, almost all my kids mess it up the first time they looked at it, was a literal fill in the blank form used by the British government for an African leader to sign over their territory. Now, when you make a fill in the blank form, what does that imply about the need for that form? Would you create a blank form for something that's going to happen twice?
It's a high demand for it.
It's high demand. Very good, Bella. Yeah. So this happened dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of times. Because today we look at Africa and we see 53 states. Back then there were thousands of tribes. So this happened over and over. And then you sign away your rights, and then later on, if they complain, you're like, look, your leader, your chief, your king, your emperor, whatever they call themselves, they signed this right over. Now, of course, it was still forced. There's still the threat of, we can kill you if we need to. Sign. Right? So it's technically diplomacy. Doesn't make it nice. It just means that nobody died, at least right away. And it's a way for the Europeans to just come in and flex on people and be like, you see this? You know I can use this. I know you're scared right now, but you don't want me to, right? They're like, oh, no, okay. You know, that kind of thing, right? It's threatening, it's negative, but it's less violent than actual violence. So by definition, that's diplomacy. So a diplomat looks out for the best interest of their nation with foreign countries. That's what that means. All right, cool. I have a guy I graduated from college with. He is a member of the State Department for the American government. So he and his family will live someplace for 3 or 4 years working in that embassy, helping Americans when they're abroad. So if you lose your passport, or like we had a situation 2 months ago when people were abroad and they had to come home and something that was quick, and their members of the embassy would help make that happen. So you could get home because I had several former students who were in various countries studying abroad, and they had to come home. And so they had to try to get paperwork done and things that were not expecting to happen for months. And so that's kind of a crazy situation. And so diplomats did that kind of work, if that makes any sense. All right. It also talks about the concept of settler colonies. A settler colony is when we have lots of Europeans settle in the colony where they're living, because usually it's very lucrative. So there's lots of money available there. It's usually a very nice place weather-wise. A lot of our settler colonies are coastal, so they have beaches and nice weather and all that good stuff. And you bring your families, which means you also bring your culture. You bring your holidays. You bring your food. You bring your sports. We talked about the sport of cricket, which is a very weird sport, at least to me, that only really people that used to be in the British Empire in the 19th century play. America doesn't play it very much because we were not under British control when cricket was popularized. But nations like India, Australia, Canada, even to a little bit, the Caribbean nations, Pakistan, India, they play cricket. South Africa, because it was when they were under British control that the sport was popular. So since a lot of people are living there, kids are living there, they play the sport, and that's part of that example. All right? So big empires getting bigger, United States, Japan, Europeans, Russians expanding as well, conquering much of Siberia into all the way to the Pacific Ocean. All right, so big states getting bigger. 6.3, indigenous responses. What does indigenous mean?
Native.
Correct. So native responses. Some people gonna fight back. It usually doesn't go well for them, but they fight back anyway. Another document from my beloved Responses to Imperialism doc is a local tribal leader basically saying like, look, and this leader is a woman, and her son was the chief of the tribe and he got killed. And she's basically imploring her people, they've already killed our leader, my son. Who do you think they're going to kill next? All of us. They might kill us all. We've got to fight back. And also it speaks very well to the gender politics of the time. She basically tells the men, if y'all won't fight, if you will be cowards, then the women will take up arms and we will fight. It's like, dang, this woman's fierce. She was hardcore, and she's probably 60 or 70 years old at the time, which is pretty amazing when you think about that part as well. So she's like, look, we're going to fight back because they're going to kill us anyway. We might as well fight. And so you start seeing some of that ideology in the colonies as well. There are various examples. It mentions Tupac Amaru, the tribal leader in Peru, who fights back against the Spanish control. Years from now, when we have to explain 2020 to younger people, Like I have to explain 9/11 to you all because it was just before you were born. You've heard about it, you've seen video, but you didn't live it. Someday you will have to explain the pandemic of 2020 to young people who did not live this experience. If there is one anecdote, I think, that explains what we have all been dealing with recently, it is that Kentucky's governor this week had to apologize to a man named Tupac Shakur that he thought had fake applied for a unemployment claim and then realized his name is actually Tupac Shakur and that is his real name, and the governor had to apologize to him for making fun of a guy that was his real name. If that doesn't explain 2020, I don't know what does. So there you go. Because he's like, Tupac died in the 90s. Well, actually, this Tupac is still alive. And Tupac Shakur, the rapper, is named after Tupac Amaru, the Peruvian resistance fighter from the 18th century, because Tupac Shakur's mother was a Black Panther Party member, a revolutionary of her own, fighting for racial equality in the early 1970s. So anyway, so there are numerous revolts, etc. We also, in some point, create new states. It mentions the Cherokee Nation. That is what we would call Native American reservations. And those states are independent. When you go into tribal land, the rules are different. They have their own police forces, their own laws that may be different from the state you were just in 5 minutes ago. Another coronavirus anecdote, we're looking to kind of bring back sports as part of life for many of us that enjoy that process. For a long time now, the only major sports league, and I don't know if it's major, still existing is Belarusian soccer. So I don't know if anybody's been following along with any Belarusian soccer, but you can actually gamble on it. If you were to cross over to Indiana, you can gamble on Belarusian soccer because it's one of the only things to bet on currently right now. But the Ultimate Fighting Championship is trying to have events, and they've been canceled because various places said, too early. They almost had one last weekend on a Native American reservation in California because Native American reservations have their own laws, et cetera, even separate from the rest of the state. So even though California is now under state lockdown until the end of the month, the Native American reservation chief could have allowed that to have happened. But then that person got some pressure, like saying, this is going to look bad for you public relations wise. They have a casino there. Whenever casinos are open again, people may be mad at you and not go to your casino and go to another one because you held an event that could help spread the virus, blah, 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 blah. So that's an example of the independence of Native American reservations as an example of anti-imperial new states. Now, of course, in America, what land do we give to these people? The crappiest land possible. I don't know if you've ever been to a Native American reservation. They're usually in the middle of nowhere, pretty bad land, not a lot of resources. Almost like that was done on purpose. After the forced marches of people thousands of miles away from their homes, like the Trail of Tears in the southern United States, for example. All right, anyway, there's also talk of rebellion, some of it based on religion. We talked about the Xhosa cattle killing movement in southern Africa, that a teenage girl, just about your all's ages, had a vision that her deceased uncle told her that if she would inspire her tribe to kill all their cattle, which was the basis of their livelihoods, that the ancestors of these people would come back in ghost form and help defeat the invaders. Of course, that didn't happen. They killed their cattle and thousands of people starved to death. It's a tragic tale, very sad stuff. But that's an example of people basically desperate, clinging to anything. Another one of those documents in this DBQ, which is the last time I mentioned, and I promise, that I really liked, was it was German soldiers making fun of Native Africans because they were rubbing some sort of ointment on their bodies, and they said that this would protect them from bullets. Of course, that's not true, but when you're desperate and you got nothing else, you got no bullets of your own, you have no weapons to fight back with, you have no protection against, there's no armor or anything like that, they would use magic gels because at least it gave people hope when they had to fight. So it's a very, very sad situation that thousands and thousands of people die believing in some sort of hoax that might help them have a better chance. But of course they don't, because when you have industrial technology, you're going to win. If you don't, you're going to lose. It's just that simple. All right, next one. We're out of imperialism into other things. 6.4, global economic development. The world is increasingly globalized. I have told you numerous times. I fully believe your DBQ will be A, time periods 1, 2, 3. B, something about globalization. And this would be a great example of that as you describe the increasing. Of course, the answer to the question is upward trend. We are going up, more increasing globalization from time periods 1, 2, and 3. A great example is the integration of the global economy. Those of us that still produce raw goods in time period 3, send them to places that manufacture them into something as a finished product, often through industrial means. As more and more countries become industrialized, they produce less and less of their own food, which means they have to import food from people that don't have industrialization often, and we trade them industrial goods in exchange for the food. And so this is an example of a more global empire. Capitalism basically preaches that no nation can make all of its own materials. We are going to have to rely on each other. We're going to have to share. We're going to have to trade. If I don't want to trade with you, at some point, people may not want to trade with me. We have to have two sides willing to negotiate to have trade. This also leads to massive increase in migration, more people moving around the world. We'll talk about that more in a second, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The logic of this is that if we are more integrated economically, we are less likely to fight each other because we rely on each other for necessities of life. It doesn't quite work out in time period 4, but that's at least the logic anyway. All right. Moving on, 6.5, page 120, it says economic imperialism. We used a different term for this. We called it neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism. This is when you are politically independent, but you need economic assistance as a young, poor nation. When you ask for that assistance, you'll often be given it, but if I borrow money from somebody, then they have control over what I do to some extent. And I gave you the example of your parents giving you loan money to pay for your first apartment as you're trying to become a DJ. And at some point, your parents may go, I'm going to cut you off if you don't get a real job. Be a DJ if you want to, but I need you to like make your own money. You're 24 years old. You need to pay your own rent. And we love you, but at some point, if going to clown college or becoming a carny or becoming a DJ isn't going to pay your bills, then you need to do something that does. In other words, time to grow up. Classic late teens, early 20s parent speech. Time to grow up. I'm sure none of you will ever have to hear that speech, but it's coming. Potentially, maybe some of your siblings have received this or will receive this, but time to grow up. You got to pay your own bills. You got to do that own thing. We all got to do what we all got to do. God forbid if I had trouble paying my bills, I would work 17 jobs before I asked my parents for a handout. But, when I was 22, that was much more of a possibility. At my age, that's not really something I'm worried about. But when I was young, there were times I was like, oh boy, and you had to, maybe I didn't go out that weekend and I had to save that money to pay my rent instead. Responsibility, it sucks. But that's how life works sometimes. You got to not have as much fun so you can do adult stuff, whatever that means. So various countries, especially in Latin America, when they're independent early in time period 3, they are not industrialized. So they are not making industrial goods. They're still primarily growing cash crops, sugar, coffee, et cetera, et cetera. They're still selling those goods to rich nations like in Western Europe and the United States. And if they want to do things like build more schools, build more roads, expand their military, they often have to borrow money to do that. And the Europeans and the Americans will let them do so, but with restrictions. You may remember, you may not. I'll give you an example. In period 4, early in the time period, we talked about how Mexico had a revolution. One of the reasons for the Mexican Revolution was that 25%, 1 out of 4, of all land in Mexico in 1910 was owned by an American. That is an example of neo-colonialism because therefore when the profits are given, the profits will go to the border across the United States. And many people in Mexico do not benefit from that wealth that is created from that farm, that land. And so that's an example of neo-colonialism. We also see other practices, for example, when the British force in opium en masse into China. And the Chinese are unable to stop it. And we get 1 million+ people in China addicted to opiates, which is a terrible concept. Many of them upper class workers for the government. We end up with 2 wars. The Chinese actually try to resist selling opium. They collect it at one point and destroy it. And the British get mad. And so they invade. And they win 2 wars easily, even though they have less than 1% of the Chinese population. Because they have industrial technology, they win. They enforce more regulations on the Chinese. They never fully colonize them, but they say that they can own property, they can build houses of worship, they can build businesses, and we see all of those things happen in China in the middle of time period 3, which enrages the Chinese because of their Middle Kingdom philosophy, but there's nothing they can do to stop it, so they have to deal. So they're never fully colonized, but they're absolutely influenced by either A, economic imperialism, or as I prefer to call it, neo-colonialism. It's not political, it's economic in nature. All right, does that make sense? Everybody good with that? All right, we're almost done. The last topic, migration. There are two topics for this one, causes and effects. Oddly enough, it's amazing how that pattern works in AP World Study Guides. Causes and effects are in there a lot. All right, causes of migration. Why do most people move then and now?
Work.
Work, correct. All right. As the great economic philosopher Rihanna said, work, 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 work. So we have migration to get jobs all around the planet. Traveling is much more available now than ever because of industrial technology, steamships and whatnot, railroads. It's cheaper. People can afford it. Many people can, and they come for a better life, often from non-industrial to industrial societies looking for work. Not always, but often that is the pattern. We're going to an industrial place for work, or we travel elsewhere for agricultural work because we'll get paid more. All right. I know, for example, with certain things right now, they're looking at in places like California where much of America's produce is grown. And much of that produce is picked by migrant workers, many of them from Mexico, who come across the border for 3-4 months, do the picking, make enough money to support their family that they can make in Mexico by a good amount, and then travel across the border. Is that going to be able to happen this year? Probably not. That means we're going to need Americans to step up and pick those strawberries or pick those whatever. And right now there's great concern that that will be the case because the reason we hire migrant employees in the first place is not enough American citizens often want to do that kind of work. Okay, I'm going to wait for something better to come along. That tends to be the attitude, which is why migrant labor exists in the first place. So we'll be interested to see how that works. There might be like college students who are, taking some time off or not able to have, physical classes on campus over the summer, be able to do that kind of work. Who knows? We'll see. But it's an interesting trend. Another example of how the current situation is impacting long-standing trends in globalization in the economy. I know this is period 4 stuff, but again, post-context is something you need for your DBQ. What is life like after time period 3 in the same idea? So I'm giving you various examples because it's something we're all dealing with right now. And if some of it sticks, that would allow you to write a good example of post-context, if that's something you'd like to do, which I imagine it is. All right. And we also see internal migration, not just external, people moving from countryside to cities in their own country, often again for economic hopes, better life, better jobs. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's why cities get bigger. Cities have sanitation problems. Often we have trouble with the sewage from humans producing a huge environment before the technology gets better. And of course, crime. Most of us that commit crime do so because we're hungry, because we're poor, not because we're, some sort of like Batman supervillain. It's just because we're hungry and we don't know how to feed our family. And we try to get a job and there are none available in the city at that time. So that's something we definitely have to work with. All right. And then lastly, 6.7, the effects of migration. Obviously, we have more global cultural exchange. Even in Louisville right now, with restaurants closed and takeout available only in some places, I can probably get 20 different ethnic flavors of food for lunch in the next 45 minutes if I wanted to, within a 20-minute drive of my house. That's globalization. That's an impact directly because most of that food and those different cultural attributes will come from people who move to the United States or other places, and they also bring their food with them. And so that food then becomes popular. If you go to Britain today, the most popular like late night snack if you're out with friends is chicken tikka marsala, which is Indian food. So that's an example as well of that cultural diffusion happening all over the world as people move. They bring different things with them, words from their languages, but of course also their food, which is something that many of us try to enjoy. I love different ethnic foods. It's fantastic. So I'm sure many of you as well, if you have, it's good stuff. Try new things, new sauces, new flavors, always fun. I enjoy that. So anyway, now this is going to be a shocker. This is the last point. Not all places and all people will welcome immigrants. So many immigrants will be discriminated against. They'll be told that we don't hire people like you. We will pass laws in numerous countries restricting immigration. In Australia, we only allow white people to immigrate into Australia for almost 100 years. In the United States, even though Chinese immigrants build the vast majority of our railroads out west, whenever that railroad network is completed in the 1860s, we then about a decade later pass a law restricting Chinese immigration to the United States for 70 years. We end it because of World War II, because we need workers, so I guess we'll let you in. So there are numerous discriminatory policies all around the world because of either dislike of people's culture or a fear that these new immigrants will take our jobs for native born peoples. All those things are part of it. And so we see that movement quite prominently as we get more interaction with people that are different than us, which happens almost every place at every time. It's takes some getting used to if you've never been around people different than you to do so. All right, that is just the case of any of us in those situations. If you've ever traveled in a foreign country and most everyone else is speaking a different language, it is a very surreal experience to hear 90% of what's going on around you can't understand. If you've never had that happen, that is interesting. It makes you think, I wonder if this is like this for people that move in a neighborhood from a different place. Could be. You never know. I don't know what their skills are, but yeah, that could be the case. And usually it gives you a little more empathy, a little more understanding of what other people are going through, which is a good thing for most of us. All right. So that's what I have in terms of that content. Does anyone have any questions for me about that specifically? I do want to go over kind of the plan going forward for a couple minutes before we end. Anybody? Everybody good?